The woman who came home. Part 1, the lobby. The security guard was a young man, couldn't have been more than 25, with a neat uniform and the careful eyes of someone trained to notice things. He looked at me the way people look at a piece of paper they expect to be blank and find instead covered in fine print they don't know how to read. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said. "The system shows a different Mrs. Whitmore on file." I heard the words. I understood them individually, but arranged in that order, spoken in that tone, they refused to enter me the way ordinary sentences do. I smiled, the automatic smile I had been polishing for 38 years, the one that said everything is fine, I am fine, there is no reason to worry, and I waited for him to correct himself. He did not correct himself. Behind me, the elevator opened. The sound was clean and decisive, a small chime followed by the smooth hydraulic exhale of the doors. I heard the footsteps before I turned, a particular kind of footstep, confident and unhurried, the sound of someone who has never once been asked whether she has an appointment. She was perhaps 40, dark hair pinned back simply, a navy blazer over dark trousers. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm and walked with the comfortable authority of someone returning to a room she decorated herself. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore." The receptionist at the desk said it warmly. The security guard nodded. 2 other people near the entrance looked up and smiled. She acknowledged them all with a practiced half-nod, gracious, unhurried, and walked on without slowing. I stood beside the reception desk. No one spoke to me. In that moment, I was aware of the marble floor beneath my shoes. I was aware of the slight dampness of my palms. I was aware of the light coming through the tall glass windows and the distant sounds of the city outside. I was aware of everything except what to do next. But somewhere beneath the numbness, something very old and very stubborn pulled itself upright. I would not leave, not like this, not without understanding what I was looking at. My name is Vivienne Elspeth Hartwell Whitmore. I am 62 years old. I taught secondary school English and literature in the county of Somerset, England, for 26 years, and I spent the last 12 years of my working life as head of faculty, which meant I spent a great deal of time listening carefully to things people said, and an equal amount of time noticing the things they did not. I retired 3 years ago when my husband Edward suggested, gently, reasonably, that we had enough between us. His career at Whitmore and Associates, the architecture and property development firm his grandfather had founded, had grown into something substantial. We had a house in the country, a cottage we rented out in Wales, savings, pensions, health. There was, Edward said, no reason for me to keep driving 40 minutes each way and spending my days marking essays when we could be living properly. I believed him. I had, as it turned out, believed Edward Whitmore a great many things over 38 years. We met when I was 23 and he was 26, at a summer party held in the garden of mutual friends. He was already drawing buildings in his head, always thinking 3-dimensionally about the world, always wanting to know how things were made to stand. I was finishing my postgraduate teaching certificate and reading everything I could find. We were, on the surface, different people. But there was something in the way he listened, really listened, without preparing his response while I was still speaking. That made me feel, for the first time in my adult life, genuinely heard. We married the following year. We had 2 children, James and Catherine. We moved 4 times as Edward's firm grew, each house a little larger, a little further from the city center, a little closer to the version of life we had sketched out together in those early years. I gave up a deputy headship once, when Catherine was small and unwell and needed more of me than any job title could justify. Edward thanked me for it. I told him it was no sacrifice. I believed that too. The warmth between us did not disappear all at once. That is the thing no one tells you about long marriages. The cooling is so gradual that you cannot point to the moment it began. You only notice, years later, that you have been keeping yourself warm from the inside for a very long time without quite realizing that the room had gone cold. Edward worked long hours. He had always worked long hours, that was simply his nature. But somewhere in the last decade, the working hours became a kind of wall rather than just a habit. He was present at dinners, present at family gatherings, present at the small domestic moments of our life together. But he was present the way a well-made piece of furniture is present. There, functional, taking up the right amount of space, not drawing attention to itself. I told myself it was age. I told myself it was the particular exhaustion of a man who had built something large and now carried the weight of maintaining it. I told myself that the absence of conflict meant the presence of stability. I understand now, an exceptionally talented self-deceiver. The morning everything changed, I had found a document on the printer. Edward used the home printer occasionally for things he didn't want to deal with at the office. Contractor quotes, personal correspondence. He had asked me the previous week to send a birthday card to his cousin Derek, and I had gone to the printer to collect the address label he'd said he'd leave for me. The address label was there. Beneath it was a page he hadn't collected. It was a lease renewal notice. A flat in Bristol, signed in Edward's name. Annual rent paid, as it had apparently been paid for the past 11 years, by a direct debit from an account I had never seen. I read it twice. I set it down. I made a cup of tea, which I did not drink. Then I picked up the paper again and read it a third time. I did not telephone Edward. I did not telephone anyone. I drove instead to Bristol, to the address on the lease notice first, which was a clean modern building near the waterfront, then on to his office, where I had not been in nearly 2 years and where I had, in all those years, never once been denied entry. Until that morning. I stood in the lobby of Whitmore and Associates' Bristol headquarters and made a quiet decision. I looked at the receptionist, whose professional smile had developed a slight strain around the edges, and I said, "I believe I'm slightly early for my meeting with your HR department. Would you mind if I waited upstairs?" She hesitated. I am 62 years old and I was wearing a well-cut coat and sensible shoes, and my expression contained no hint of the earthquake occurring quietly beneath it. People in states of shock, I have observed, often look remarkably composed. "Of course," she said, and called upstairs, and within a few minutes I was in the elevator. I pressed the button for the 4th floor, where Edward's office had always been, rather than the 3rd, where HR was housed. The elevator obliged without comment. The 4th floor was quieter than the lobby. Wide windows, good carpet, the particular hush of people engaged in expensive thinking. I walked slowly toward the central corridor, taking in the layout as though I were mapping a building I intended to remember. And there she was again. Closer now, not moving through the space this time, but standing near a cluster of desks, talking to a man I didn't recognize, pointing at something on a page he was holding. She had an ease about her that was not arrogance. She was not performing authority. She simply inhabited it. People orbited her with the comfortable familiarity of long habit. I stopped near a tall plant, the kind of plant offices acquire when someone once read that greenery improves well-being, and I listened. "Dinner reservation is at 7, a woman was saying somewhere behind me. "Mr. Whitmore's driver will collect them both from the Clifton meeting." "Does Genevieve want the usual table or the private room?" someone else asked. "Private room, I think. They have the school thing to discuss." Genevieve. I held the name carefully, the way you hold something you suspect might be fragile. "The kids are at his mother's tonight, so they can take their time." The kids. The phrase arrived like a stone dropped into still water. I felt the ripples move through me, and I said nothing and let them pass. I moved further along the corridor until I found a small alcove near the printer station, where I could see Edward's office door, closed, and hear, faintly, the people around me continuing their ordinary Wednesday morning. 11 minutes later, the door opened. Edward came out first. He was 64, silver-haired, still straight-backed in the way of men who have spent decades being looked at by clients and employees. Behind him came the woman, Genevieve. They were talking quietly, not touching, the particular distance of two people who have negotiated proximity into a habit. "I'll meet you at the car," Edward said to the man following them. "Give us 5 minutes." The man moved away. Genevieve said something I didn't catch. Edward smiled, the smile I hadn't seen in so long I had almost forgotten the particular way it creased his eyes at the corners, and said, I know. Thursday, then. She touched his arm, briefly, and walked back toward the central area. Edward stood for a moment watching the direction she had gone, then turned toward his office. He saw me. The sequence of expressions across his face lasted perhaps 3 seconds and contained an entire autobiography. Part 2, the office. I walked toward him. He did not move. I entered his office ahead of him. He had always said I carried a room differently than other people, something to do with the way teachers learn to own a space, and I stood in the center of it and waited while he closed the door. His office was exactly as I remembered it, the architectural drawings framed on the wall, the photograph of our children taken on a Welsh hillside when Catherine was 9 and James was 12, squinting into the sun, the oak desk his grandfather had used. These objects looked, from the outside, like the room of a man with nothing hidden. Vivienne, he said. His voice was hoarse in a way it hadn't been when he left the house that morning. Sit down, I said, not unkindly. He sat, I remained standing, old teacher's habit. I found the lease notice, I said. The Bristol flat, I went past it on the way here. He closed his eyes. Don't, I said, before he could speak. Don't start with I can explain, because I have been a literature teacher for nearly 30 years, and I know every opening to every story and I know which ones are true. Just tell me. He opened his eyes, and he told me. Her name was Genevieve Marsh. He had met her 12 years ago at an industry conference in Edinburgh. She was a structural engineer with one of his partner firms. Brilliant, he said, then seemed to hear himself saying it and stopped. Their professional relationship had become something else over the course of that conference and the 3 that followed. He had ended it, he said, or tried to end it twice. The second time it had already become impossible to end because Genevieve was pregnant. The child, a girl, now 9 years old, was named Rosa. Edward had a daughter I had never known about. I sat down then, not because I was overcome, but because I made a considered decision that sitting was the appropriate response to what I had just been told, in the same way you sit when the doctor gives you news that requires processing in a calm and measured way. She doesn't use your name, I said. No, she uses mine professionally. It's complicated. The firm, the professional relationship, he stopped. Some people here know her as they know she's. They know she's your partner, I said. They call her Mrs. Whitmore. He didn't deny it. For how long, I said, have people here known? He was quiet for long enough that I understood the answer was longer than I want to tell you. You had 2 families, I said. I was not raising my voice. I have sat with students through confessions of plagiarism, of cruelty to classmates, of things that happened at home that should never happen at home, and I have learned that a calm voice reaches further than a loud one. You had a wife and children in Somerset and a partner and a daughter in Bristol and a professional life that apparently seamlessly accommodated both. I know what it sounds like. Edward, I looked at him, really looked at him, the way I had not looked at him in a very long time, not the looked-past looking of long familiarity, but the clear, appraising look of someone assessing what she is actually seeing. I am not interested in what it sounds like. I am interested in what it is. He told me more. He told me in the clipped, tightly controlled way of a man who has rehearsed this conversation in his head for years without ever quite believing he would have to deliver it. The flat in Bristol had been leased initially as a professional convenience. He spent many nights in Bristol. It was more practical than hotels. Genevieve had moved in 2 years after they met. Rosa had been born into a flat that Edward paid for, in a life that Edward funded, in a world that Edward's colleagues apparently understood and accommodated without anyone ever thinking to mention it to his wife. Why didn't you leave me? I asked. He flinched. I want to understand it, I said. Not so I can use it against you. I want to understand what the last 12 years actually were. I didn't want to lose either of you, he said, which is the thing men say. The thing that sounds from the inside like love and looks from the outside like cowardice. You didn't want to choose, I said. Those are different things. He didn't argue. I stood up. I straightened my coat. I picked up my handbag from the floor where I had set it. I'm going home, I said. You should not come home tonight. Vivienne. I am not asking you, I said. I am telling you, do not come home tonight. I walked to the door. My hand was steady on the handle. I am sorry, Edward said from behind me. I know that isn't enough. It isn't, I agreed, and I left. Part 3, the house. I drove home in the particular state of clarity that descends, sometimes, after shock has had its full effect, and the mind stops bracing against what it has already received. The roads were familiar. The light was the particular pale gold of late afternoon in autumn. Everything was exactly as it had been that morning when I left the house, and absolutely nothing was the same. The house greeted me with its usual silence. We had lived there for 14 years, a converted farmhouse in a village outside Taunton, the kind of house that takes decades to learn and rewards patience with warmth. I had chosen the kitchen tiles. I had planted the herb garden. I had repainted the hallway twice, each time a shade closer to the soft gray-green I had been trying to find. I walked through it slowly. In Edward's study, I found what I suppose some part of me had known I would find. He was not a careless man. He had kept his second life separate with the same meticulous attention he applied to his professional projects. But I was not a careless woman either, and 38 years of living alongside a person teaches you where they keep things. The second drawer of his desk. A locked document wallet. The key was on his personal keyring, but he kept a spare taped to the underside of the middle shelf, which he thought I didn't know. But I had noticed it 10 years ago when I was looking for the spare torch batteries. Inside, bank statements. A savings account and a current account, both in his sole name, both with a transaction history going back to before the lease began. Regular significant transfers to a standing order I now had no difficulty identifying. Receipts from a private school in Bristol, Rosa's school fees, paid promptly every term for 6 years. Birthday cards and envelopes, unsent, written in Edward's handwriting. Happy birthday, my Rosa Rose. 7 years old. I am so proud of you. I sat on the floor of the study, with these things spread around me. My husband had a daughter named Rosa who was 9 years old and apparently called him Dad, and whose birthday he celebrated privately, in writing, in cards he sealed and kept but never sent. I don't know what I felt. I am, generally, someone who can name her own feelings. It comes with the territory of having taught literature, having spent years asking young people to articulate what a poem was doing to them. But sitting on that study floor, I was simply inside something too large to name. I put everything back exactly as I had found it. I locked the document wallet. I replaced the key. Then I telephoned a solicitor. Her name was Patricia Holt. She had been recommended to me by my friend Dorothea, who had been through something similar 6 years previously and come out the other side still standing. Patricia answered on the second ring, listened to my 3-sentence summary without interrupting, and told me what I needed to do first and in what order. Do you want to discuss whether reconciliation is something you're considering? She asked. No, I said. Understood, said Patricia, and we began. That night I slept, or lay in the dark in something that resembled sleep, in the spare bedroom. Not because I was making a dramatic gesture, but because the bedroom I had shared with Edward for over 30 years was currently a room I had no desire to enter. In the morning, I telephoned my children. James came alone. Catherine came with her husband, Daniel, who had the good sense to make himself very quiet in the kitchen, while Catherine sat beside me on the sitting room sofa and held my hand. I had spent 20 minutes deciding how to begin and arrived at the conclusion that there was no gentle beginning. There was only the thing itself. Your father has been living a second life for 12 years, I said. He has a partner in Bristol, a woman called Genevieve Marsh. They have a daughter together. Her name is Rosa. She is 9 years old. James stood up, sat down again, said what? In the voice of someone who has heard correctly and his hopping repetition will change the content. Catherine said nothing for a long time. Her hand tightened on mine. You're sure, James said. I have the bank statements, the lease agreement, and the school fee receipts, I said. Yes, I'm sure. The next hour was the hardest of my life to that point, which is saying something, because I have sat in hospital corridors, and I have buried my parents, and I have delivered news to families that no family wants to receive. But watching my children receive this particular truth, watching 38 years of their certainty rearrange itself into a different shape, that was its own particular category of grief. James was angry in the way of someone who wants very much to do something and has no clear target. He paced. He said things about Edward that were true and painful to hear. Catherine cried in the careful way of someone who is trying not to, her lower lip pressed together, her eyes very bright, the tears arriving despite everything. What will you do? Catherine asked eventually. I'm divorcing your father, I said. I've already spoken with a solicitor. Where will you go? I'll stay here, I said. This is my home. Something in both of them seemed to settle slightly at that. The house was still here. I was still here. The ground had shifted but had not entirely given way. Do we have a sister? James said. He said it to the window. Half-sister, I said. Yes. He was silent. She is 9 years old and she did not choose any of this, I said carefully. Whatever you feel about your father, I ask you not to direct it at her. She is a child. James turned from the window. His face was raw in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. How are you this calm? I'm not calm, I said. I'm contained. Those are different things. I have 38 years of practice being contained. He came and sat beside me then, on the other side from Catherine. And for a few minutes, my 2 adult children and I simply sat together in the sitting room of the house I intended to keep, while the early autumn rain came softly against the windows. Part 4, Genevieve. She telephoned 8 days later. I was in the garden, cutting back the rose bushes, which needed doing and which also turned out to be an excellent activity for a woman in my particular situation. The phone was in my coat pocket. I looked at the unknown number for a moment before answering. Vivienne Whitmore. Her voice was measured, careful, not the voice of someone who had rehearsed a performance, but of someone choosing each word in real time. Speaking. My name is Genevieve Marsh. Edward gave me your number. I know you may not want to speak with me. I'll understand completely if you'd prefer not to. I'll hear what you have to say, I said. I sat down on the garden bench. The rain had cleared and the afternoon was bright and clean. There was a silence on her end. I wanted to say that I know what you're going through isn't something you asked for, and that I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not calling for that. Then why are you calling? Another silence. I'm calling because I have a 9-year-old daughter who is asking questions I don't know how to answer. And because I think you deserve to hear from me directly, rather than only through lawyers and paperwork. I considered this. Do you love him? I asked. The question seemed to surprise her. I think I loved the life we built, she said after a moment. I'm not sure those are the same thing. No, I said, they're not. We talked for 20 minutes. It was not a comfortable conversation. How could it have been? But it was an honest one. She did not ask me to understand. I did not ask her to feel worse than she clearly already did. We were 2 women of similar intelligence who had been, in profoundly different ways, deceived by the same man, and there was something in acknowledging that plainly that made the air between us, if not warm, at least breathable. Your daughter, I said near the end. Rosa, is she? She's all right, Genevieve said. She's a bright, curious, difficult child who asks too many questions and reads above her age level. Something in me shifted slightly. She sounds rather like my Catherine at 9. A pause. Edward says the same thing. I absorbed this. She will need stable people around her through all of this, I said. She's done nothing wrong. I know. Then, I trust you'll remember that more than you'll remember anything else. We ended the call. I sat in the garden for a long time afterwards, watching the late light move across the lawn. I was not at peace. I was not anything so tidy as at peace. But I was no longer carrying Genevieve Marsh as an adversary inside my chest, and that, in that moment, was sufficient. Part 5, the work of becoming. The divorce took 14 months. Edward did not contest it. He was, in this as in the early years of our marriage, a reasonable man, and perhaps reasonable is all he ever was. Perhaps the whole architecture of our life together had been built on reasonableness rather than the deeper thing I had believed it to be. He moved permanently to Bristol. His solicitor communicated efficiently with Patricia. Assets were divided in a manner that Patricia described as fair, and I described, privately, as the minimum acknowledgement of 38 years of a life. The farmhouse was mine. The Welsh cottage was sold and divided. There were pensions and savings and various instruments of financial planning, all of which Patricia navigated on my behalf while I focused on the considerably more demanding task of continuing to exist. The first months were strange. Not terrible, strange. The days had a shape I had never given them myself. I had always been fitting my days around someone else's requirements, first the school timetable, then the children's schedules, then Edward's late returns and early departures. Now the days were simply days, empty of obligation, and I found I did not immediately know what to do with them. I started, initially with very small things. I rearranged the bookshelves, organizing them by author rather than size, which I had always wanted to do, and which Edward had found inexplicably irritating. I ate dinner at 6:30 instead of 8, because 6:30 was when I was actually hungry. I slept with the curtains open, because I liked to see the sky in the morning, and Edward had always preferred the room dark. I called Dorothea, who had been waiting, with the patient love of a good friend, for me to be ready, and we went for long walks and said plain-spoken things to one another in the bracing way of women who have been through substantial things and no longer have patience for decorative conversation. I began writing. Not a journal exactly, something less structured than that, pages and pages of rough, unfiltered material, things I was thinking through and things I was remembering and things I was trying to understand. I had always written as an English teacher, lesson plans, assessments, the occasional piece in a local literary magazine. But this was different. This was writing to hear my own mind speak without editing at first. The writing eventually became something I wanted to shape properly. I took a course at a nearby arts center, Wednesday evenings, 12 writers around a table, a facilitator named Marcus who had the useful quality of asking good questions and the even more useful quality of knowing when to stay quiet. I went the first week half expecting to feel foolish and left 2 hours later with 6 pages of something that felt, surprisingly, like the beginning of itself. I went back every Wednesday for 8 months. There were solo trips, a long weekend in the Orkneys, which I had always wanted to visit and Edward had always been too busy to consider. A week in a rented cottage in Brittany, where I walked and ate well and read 4 novels and spoke French imperfectly with the people I encountered in the village. A long weekend in Edinburgh, which felt, given its significance in the story I now knew, like something I needed to reclaim, where I walked the old city in the rain and liked it very much. On those trips I was alone in a way I had never been before, and I found, somewhat to my surprise, that I did not particularly mind it. I was good company, it turned out. I had opinions about architecture and food and the particular qualities of different lights in different latitudes, and I was perfectly capable of having those opinions without needing to report them to anyone. I thought of the years I had spent making myself smaller than I was, not because Edward had asked me to, he hadn't, or not directly, but because the habit of long partnership had slowly shaped me into the complementary piece, rather than a whole thing in myself. I had been the counterweight, the support structure, the stable foundation, and I had been good at it, and somewhere in being good at it, I had lost the thread back to the person I had been before I became those things. I was finding her again, slowly, non-linearly, with significant amounts of backtracking. There were hard evenings. I will not pretend otherwise. The particular grief of a dissolved long marriage does not arrive once and depart. It comes in waves, sometimes months apart, sometimes on consecutive days. A piece of music we had both loved. The sound of rain on the specific frequency of that farmhouse roof. Photographs I found in the back of drawers, from the years before the cooling. Edward and I on a beach in Cornwall, James as a baby on Edward's chest, Catherine's first day of school, all of us at my parents' anniversary lunch, faces open and genuine. Those years had been real. The love in those photographs had been real. This was the thing I had to hold at the same time as everything else, that a person can betray you completely and also have once been true. Part 6, Thomas. I met Thomas Redley in an entirely unromantic way, which in retrospect suits us perfectly. He was having car trouble on a wet November road 3 miles from my house. I spotted his hazard lights from a distance, pulled over, and offered the use of my phone since his had died. We stood in the rain while he called his breakdown service, and I tried unsuccessfully to locate my emergency umbrella, and the conversation that emerged from that practical situation turned out to be the most interesting 40 minutes I had spent in some time. He was 66, recently retired from a career in conservation. He had spent most of his working life with a rewilding project in Wales, widowed 4 years earlier. He had a dryness to him that emerged slowly and was all the funnier for it. He asked good questions. He listened to the answers as if he intended to remember them. "Thank you," he said, when the breakdown lorry arrived. "I'd give you my number, but my phone is dead, and I fear I'm insufficiently young to remember anyone's number by heart." "I'll give you mine," I said and did. He called 2 days later to thank me properly and to propose a walk, if I was local and interested. I was both. We walked for 3 hours that first Saturday, along a ridge path above the valley, and talked without stopping about books and birds and the architecture of watersheds and what it means to do work that outlasts you. He had the comfortable directness of a person who had been sad for a long time and had reached the other side of it. He did not perform cheerfulness. He did not ask me intrusive questions. When I mentioned, at one point, that I was recently divorced after a long marriage, he simply said, "I'm sorry, that's a hard thing," and moved on, which was exactly the right thing to do. We walked again the following week, and the week after. There was nothing rushed about what developed between us. This was, I think, its central quality. We were both old enough to know the difference between urgency and importance, and to have developed a considerable immunity to the former. We met when we both wanted to meet. We gave each other enormous quantities of room. He did not appear at my door without invitation. I did not adjust my schedule around his availability. But he was there in the way that matters. A message on a Tuesday morning. "There's a peregrine nesting on the church tower at Compton Bishop if you want to see it." An offer, on a difficult day I had mentioned in passing, to simply sit with me on the bench in my herb garden and drink tea and not say anything in particular. "You don't talk about him much," he said one evening, when we were sitting by the fire in his small rented house near Wells. "Edward, no," I said. "I've thought about him a great deal. I've talked about him a great deal to my solicitor and my children and to myself. I'm not sure there's much left to say." "Fair enough," Thomas said, and turned a page of his book. I thought, this is what it's supposed to feel like. Not the electricity of young love, not the drama of need meeting need. This, the capacity to sit in the same room in companionable silence and both be genuinely glad of the company. I told my children about him at Christmas, when James and Catherine and their families came for the holiday. The first Christmas in the farmhouse without Edward, and the first one, I had decided, with all the furniture arranged the way I actually wanted it. "He sounds like a good person," Catherine said. "He is a good person," I said. "That's rather the point." James, who had spent several months in the particular fury of a son whose father has disappointed him, and was only now beginning to find his way to something more complex and livable, said, "Are you happy, Mum?" I thought about it honestly. "I'm well," I said. "I'm interested in things again. I wake up in the mornings with plans." I looked at him. "I think that might be what happy is at this age." Part 7, the hospital. Edward had a cardiac event in February. James telephoned at 7 in the morning. The consultant's language was carefully calibrated, significant asterisk, stable asterisk, asterisk monitoring, and I listened to it with the practiced attention of someone who has learned that the significant information in medical updates is often in the pauses. "I'll come," I said. I drove to Bristol. Thomas offered to come with me. I said no and thanked him, and he said simply, "I'll be here when you're back," which was the right answer. The hospital was the particular kind that had been built in the 1970s and repeatedly modified since, which gave it the slightly disorganized energy of a document edited too many times. I found the cardiology ward, found the waiting area outside Edward's room, and found my children. Catherine stood and hugged me. James, looking thin and tired, hugged me too. "He's sleeping," James said. "The cardiologist says it's not as bad as it looked overnight. He's going to need significant changes." I nodded. Then I saw, in the corridor adjacent to the waiting room, Genevieve. She looked, as people do in hospitals, reduced, stripped of the professional composure I had observed in Edward's office. She was wearing ordinary clothes, and no makeup, and her dark hair was pulled back unevenly. Beside her, holding her hand with the matter-of-fact propriety of a child who has learned that holding a parent's hand is the appropriate response to serious situations, was a small girl with Edward's coloring and an expression of careful, watchful concentration. Rosa. My children had seen them before I had. I watched Catherine and James absorb the sight, the particular complexity of absorbing it, the daughter they hadn't known existed, the small face that was and was not familiar. It was Catherine who moved first. She crossed the corridor in a few steps, crouched down to the child's level and said, "Hello, I'm Catherine. I think I might be your sister." The child considered this with the gravity of someone who has been given a fact that requires verification. "Half-sister," she said. "My mum explained it." "Half-sister," Catherine agreed. "That still counts." Rosa seemed to consider whether this was accurate and arrived at the conclusion that it was. "Okay," she said, and in the pragmatic way of 9-year-olds, for whom categories, once established, are sufficient to proceed on, asked Catherine whether she'd brought anything to eat because she was very hungry and the hospital cafe was far away. Something released in my chest. Not everything, not cleanly, but something. I looked at Genevieve. She was watching Catherine and Rosa with an expression I recognized, the expression of a parent watching a child navigate something difficult with unexpected grace, and feeling both proud and bereft at the same moment. "She's all right," I said. Genevieve looked at me. "Thank you for coming." "He was the father of my children for 38 years, I said. "That doesn't stop." She nodded. We did not say anything else, but we stood in the same corridor with something approaching the neutral ground of people who have agreed, without words, that there is no point in making this harder than it already is. When I went in to see Edward, he was awake. He looked smaller than the last time I had seen him, and I had a thought, unwanted and true, that this was what happened when the architecture came down. The person inside the structure was revealed to have exactly the ordinary dimensions of any other person. "Vivienne," he said, "how are you feeling?" "Foolish," he said, "mostly foolish." I sat in the chair beside his bed. Outside the window, a pale winter sun was trying to be useful. "The children are here," I said. "Catherine and James." "I know, they came in earlier." He paused. "Rosa is with Genevieve." "I know." He looked at me. "I didn't expect you to come." "I know you didn't." We were quiet for a moment. The monitoring equipment made its measured sounds. "I have been thinking," Edward said, "about the kind of person I turned out to be. And I think I was very good at the surface of things," he said. "The house, the firm, the career, the appearance of being a man who managed everything well. I was less. I was not good at what was underneath." "No," I agreed. I told myself for years that keeping things separate was a form of consideration, that I was protecting you. "You were protecting yourself," I said. "I know the difference." He didn't argue. "Yes." "Edward," I leaned forward slightly, "I did not come here to revisit what happened. I came because your children needed me here, and because after 38 years I am still capable of sitting in this room without wishing you harm. That is the extent of what I can offer, and I offer it freely." He looked at me for a long time. "You were always the better person," he said. "I was always the more honest one," I said. "That's different." I stayed for 40 minutes. When I left, I stopped in the corridor to say goodbye to James and Catherine, who would stay longer. I looked once more toward where Genevieve and Rosa were sitting. Rosa was now drawing something in a notebook, her tongue pressed to her lower lip in concentration, and Genevieve was watching her with the particular exhausted tenderness of a parent in a difficult situation trying very hard. I nodded to Genevieve. She nodded back. I took the lift down to the ground floor and walked out through the hospital's sliding doors into the cold February afternoon. I stood on the pavement for a moment and telephoned Thomas. "All done," I said. "How are you?" I thought about it. Relieved, I think, and tired, and ready to come home. "I'll put the kettle on," he said. "Drive carefully." Epilogue, spring. The spring that followed was the first in many years that felt entirely mine. The farmhouse had settled into itself differently, not dramatically, just with the quiet assurance of a space that has stopped waiting for someone who is not coming back. I had repainted Edward's study. His books went to a local library. I kept only the ones I had loved myself. I had planted a new bed of dahlias along the south-facing wall, which my mother had always grown and I had always meant to. I had given the Welsh dresser to Catherine, who had always loved it, and replaced it with a simpler piece I found in a local auction room, older, plainer, more completely itself. I finished the writing course and began, with more optimism than certainty, working on something longer. A novel, perhaps, or whatever the thing became on its own terms. Marcus, the facilitator, had told me once that the difference between writers who finish work and writers who don't is not talent, but the willingness to sit in uncertainty for extended periods. I was learning, rather later in life than ideal, to sit in uncertainty. Thomas came on Sundays. Sometimes I went to him. We had begun, quietly and without announcement, to talk about things slightly further in the future. A trip to Iceland he had always wanted to take, a long stay flat in Edinburgh for the festival next summer. Not promises, exactly. Plans. The kind of plans that acknowledge a shared future without demanding that it be defined in advance. My children came often. Rosa, in the complicated way of these things, in the slow, non-linear way that real families rather than tidy narrative families function, had met Catherine 3 more times, and James once, and these meetings had the particular atmosphere of people feeling their way carefully along an unfamiliar surface, not yet sure of their footing but committed to trying. She sent Catherine a drawing she had done, a horse, apparently, though it bore some resemblance to a rhinoceros, and Catherine had it framed and placed on her mantelpiece, which seemed to me the right response. One morning in late April, I sat on the bench in the herb garden with a mug of tea, watching the light move across the south wall where the dahlias were coming up. Thomas had left an hour earlier. He had a volunteer day with a wetland project near Glastonbury. The house was quiet in the way of a house that has found its settled self. I thought about the morning in that Bristol lobby, the security guard and his careful, puzzled eyes, the elevator opening, the footsteps I had heard before I understood what they meant, the moment I made a decision, without knowing I was making it, to stay and look and understand. I had been looking for proof of betrayal, and I had found it. But I had also found something else, the proof that I was still someone who would not turn away from a hard thing. That after 38 years of standing carefully behind a shared life, there was still a self standing there, opinionated and observant, a little stubborn, capable of walking into a room and telling the truth about what she saw.